Hello, welcome everybody. I wasn't aware there will be time for questions at the end. I'm going to try my best. Thank you all for coming. This is going to be an exciting, hopefully, adrenaline-packed, probably not, but rapid look at what is essentially based on a 3-hour workshop called Write Your Own Web Store in Hours. We are not going to be here for hours. It will only be 25 minutes, though. I'm going to take this off because it's jangling, and it's probably going to annoy everybody. So yes, thanks for coming along. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ben Dechrai. I've been a software engineer for way too long. I think this should actually be 23 now. I keep forgetting to update this slide. But I've been a really passionate security, privacy, civil liberties, all of those kind of things person. So eventually one day I met somebody who worked at Auth0 who said, if you like travel, you like security, you like talking to people, all these kind of things, you should become a developer advocate for Auth0. So that's where I am today. But my background and my passion is definitely still in the software engineering, privacy, security kind of things. So that's what you'll see me talking about a lot. If you want to contact me offline afterwards, offline, it would actually be online, I suppose, in this context. I'm still getting used to not being in the midst of a pandemic. My Twitter handle there, Ben Dechrai, my DMs are open. Feel free to contact me. But what I want to talk to you today is about this 3-hour workshop that I created, which was designed to basically create a web store and provide a dynamic product catalog, user authentication and checkout and payment mechanisms without a key component that we'll get to in a second. So let's have a look at some of the tech stack that I thought we should use for this design. So I obviously used Auth0. You can use any identity provider you want as long as it's OpenID Connect, Auth 2.0 compliant, and has an extensibility platform, which is what we're going to be looking at today within Auth0. I used Netlify. I'll talk in a second about why I chose that. There's no particular reason other than just for convenience. Stripe for payments and product management, and React as a mechanism for creating the web application that people are going to be using to log into to purchase the products. What's missing out of that? Database. There's one more click in there than I was expecting. So we're doing this without a custom database. Normally, you would have a database that would link your users to your products and your orders and all the rest of it. And even though some of it's stored in Stripe and some of it's in Auth0, you need a place to glue all of this information together. No matter what you're writing, you're probably going to need a custom database. And an identity provider is only going to really touch that, the login and the password reset and the single sign-on and all those aspects. The actual business logic still needs a database, but we're going to do it without a database. That's the exciting part. All right, so the design theory, we've got React, we've got Auth0, Stripe, and Netlify. The reason why I chose Netlify is because they've got really great CLI tools, which means I can run a local development server, including running functions locally. So if you wanted to do this, this workshop yourself, it's actually on GitHub. I'll probably have a link at the end somewhere. If not, come and find me. For those of you who don't know, Auth0 got bought by Okta about a year and a bit ago. So if you come to the Okta booth, that's where I've been hanging out all day. Come chat to me there afterwards if you want to try this workshop out in your own time. But it does mean that you don't actually need a Netlify account. You can actually just download the Netlify CLI tools, and you can start. If you're familiar with React development or any kind of NPM development, you've got NPM start or NPM run dev. You run Netlify dev instead, and you get all of your API, local API hosting, which is really cool for workshops. So that's why I chose that. The way it's going to work is we've got a React app, and don't worry, I've pre-written most of this, so we'll be able to look right into the code of what we're doing within Auth0, so we don't have to focus too much on React or any of those specifics. So if you're not a React developer, that's fine. But essentially what React is going to do is talk to our API and say, give me a list of all the products you have. And the API is going to grab that out of Stripe. Stripe allows you to define products and things like that. So it's going to get those products and then send them back. And then at some point, somebody's going to come to your website and they're going to click on that buy button. But we don't know how to do that yet because we don't have a concept of a user. So before we can allow somebody to buy a product, we're going to get them to log into Auth0. And before Auth0 returns information back to our application so that we know who's logged in, Auth0 is going to make a request during the login process. So they've logged in before you even get back to your web application, and this is part of the extensibility platform we have. We can run code, or you can run your own arbitrary code during that login process. So we're going to write some code that's going to make a request to Stripe to say, hey, I want you to create a new customer account. And Stripe's going to return a customer ID. And then what we're going to do is store that against the user. Who here has used Auth0 before? About 30%. Who here knows what app metadata and user metadata within Auth0 are? About the same number. Who knows which one to use when? Nobody. One, maybe. Well, that was a hesitant one. So there's a user, this slide here. There's a user metadata and there's an app metadata stored against every user within your Auth0 tenant. And essentially, user metadata is data that the user can change. It's a little bit hard, but essentially, you could, with an ID token, craft a curl request that allows you to modify. So this is good for storing things like, do they want dark mode? Because if they modify that themselves, it's not going to break things. You don't want to be storing Stripe customer IDs in there. We're going to store it in the app metadata, which is essentially metadata about a user that the app can change. So that requires an extra level of security. There's an API key to make sure that only your application is going to be able to edit that information. You can also do that within Actions, which is what we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to store the Stripe customer ID inside the app metadata, and then we can complete the authorization login flow. As part of the access token that gets sent back to our React app, we're also going to include in there the Stripe customer ID. So our application now knows what the Stripe customer ID is of the person who's logged in. And because it's sent over in JSON as a JSON web token, and for those of you who don't know what JSON web tokens are, they're basically packaged bits of information with a signature so you can verify that any claims in that JSON haven't been modified in transit. You can trust that the Stripe customer ID hasn't been modified since Stripe gave it back to Auth0. So that's how we get rid of the database, because the linking is now done between Auth0 and Stripe. So now what we can do is we can pass that access token into our Netlify app. Netlify app API endpoint is going to use standard JWT parsing and verification tools to make sure that it hasn't been modified, that it can trust it, that it's been issued by an identity provider that we trust, all of these things. And then it can pull out of there the Stripe customer ID and pass that in as part of the checkout creation process within Stripe. Who here has used Stripe before? Who's familiar with the Stripe checkout process? About 4%-ish. So essentially the way Stripe works, and we'll see it in action in a second, is you make a request to their API endpoint saying, hey, I want to start a checkout. Here's what I want this person to buy. Send me back a response that includes a URL that I will redirect the user to so that they can complete the logout process. So in the same way as Auth0 hosts your login page, Stripe can host your checkout page. So that's what we're doing at that point there. Anyway, that's a brief overview of why. Now let's get into the demo. Any questions before I get into the demo? Anything confusing about that? I mean, it's lots of information all over the place. I don't expect you to know it inside out. But cool. Yes?
How are you introducing customer data analytics if the data is not actually within us, it's actually sitting within another system?
Say that again, sorry. How do I?
Was asking about customer data analytics for that.
Mm-hmm.
If the customer data is actually sitting within an external system, how do you do this?
Well, the customer data is within Stripe, and our Netlify application can talk to Stripe, which we'll see in a bit. In fact, let's just go back to this slide. So if I start this slideshow again. So at this point here, the Netlify tools have to be able to communicate with Stripe. So our Netlify API endpoints will contain a Stripe API key in order to communicate with your Stripe tenant. So that's why we use the cloud functions within Netlify's API, because we can't put those keys into React. We can't put secret keys into an application that only sits in a browser. So by the browser making a request to the Netlify function in the backend, that's where we can store the secret keys that are able to communicate with Stripe. So in the same way as you can say to Stripe, hey, start a checkout process, here's my key, and here's the Stripe customer ID, you could also create another endpoint that says, hey, here's the customer ID, can you send me back a data blob of this customer's information, or can you tell me all the products he's or she's ordered in the past? So that communication can still happen. Yeah, good question. All right, let's jump into the demo. So this is my web store. You can tell it's my web store because it says my web store. Inside Stripe, we have a number of products. You can see here that we have a hopping shoe and a now hear this. And you can see that they are represented here. The information here is all pulled out of Stripe. So we've got the image in there, we've got the SKU, we've got the text, we've got the prices. So all of that is stored in Stripe, which means if I went into Stripe and I added a new product, it would appear on this page immediately when I hit refresh, because that's being pulled through the Netlify endpoint. So the thing we want to do is be able to log into purchase. So this part here already works. If I log in, actually, you know what hasn't happened yet? If we look into user management, we don't actually have any users. So I've just come to my website for the first time, and I need to create an account. So let's sign up. Excellent. This is showing up basically because I'm running a local host. When you're in production, most of the time you won't get this unless you actually need the user to know that they're giving permission for certain information to be passed. But we show it all the time when you're doing local host development, so you can see what's going on. So we're now in the web store. You can see that the buttons have now changed to Buy It Now. If I click on Buy It Now, though, it comes up and says, sorry, we couldn't start the checkout process because we haven't done that linkage yet. But what we can do before we jump into that is just have a look at our profile. I do not recommend that you use this layout for a production profile. You probably want something slightly prettier. But for the purposes of a demo, I think this will suffice. So you can see up there we've got a picture. I would actually turn that into, like, actually show the picture. It's a bit nicer. I think showing a URL to people is not the kind of user experience we want people to have. But there's some other information in there that's useful, just as an aside. So you can see in there the email verified is false. I will, if my watch wasn't on airplane mode, which is something I've learned to do recently since being rather embarrassingly distracted in a previous talk, I would have got a notification saying, hey, verify your email address. You know, when you get that link saying, click here to verify that you own this email address. If I did that, then that would change to true. So your application can now know whether or not the email address has been verified. But the most interesting, in air quotes, part is probably the last part, SUB, which stands for subject. So if we did need to have a custom database of some sort, normally in a traditional sense where you roll your own, don't roll your own authentication, but if you did roll your own authentication, you'd have a username and password, or very hopefully a hashed password of some sort. In this case, you wouldn't actually need to store that, you would only need to store the subject. So every time I log in the future, whether I change my email address or my password, or I log in from a different place or whatever, that subject is always going to be the same. So now what you can do in your applications is use that subject to load the user out of your database based on that. So just as an aside. But the access token is what we want to look at today, because this access token is being passed to Netlify in order to start the buy now process. We can see in there we've got the issuer, ISS. We've got the subject. Again, that's my unique ID of who I am as a person, as an entity. We have an audience. There are two services that this token is intended for. You've got the localhost port 8888, which is the Netlify functions that we're running, but we've also got this user info endpoint, which most identity providers will provide, that allows you to get more information about the user. So this token can be used for either of those. Any other system that receives this access token is going to say that's not intended for me, and should technically ignore it. Got an issue date and expiry, an authorized party, I think that stands for, and a scope. Won't go too much into that today. But the thing we don't have here at the moment is the Stripe customer ID. And in fact, if we now look at the user here, if I refresh this, we should see that there is a new user. Who else is enjoying the conference Wi-Fi? All right, so if we scroll down a bit, there we go. We can see the app metadata is currently empty. So let's fix that. Over on the left-hand side here, we've got an actions area, and we've got flows and library. I've already written them, so I'll show you where they are in the library, but essentially we've got these 6 flows that you can hook into. For this particular situation where we want to create a Stripe customer every time somebody registers, it might be reasonable to assume that we would use the post-user registration hook. After the user is registered for the first time, we'll make sure they have a Stripe customer ID. In this case, though, I already have an account, and I want to make sure that any accounts that are in the system before the action is implemented, I want to make sure that those users also get a Stripe customer ID. So I'm going to use the login, which means it's going to run every time somebody logs in. So you can see a rough representation here of what the login flow is. Somebody starts the login, and then they complete it, and the token is issued. Over on the right-hand side here, you can see there are 2 actions that I've created. You could go in and see those through the library as well. You can create custom actions, and you can also get pre-installed actions. We've got a marketplace with a whole lot of different actions that you can just drag and drop. So there's everything here from like low code, no code kind of stuff all the way to write whatever you want and we'll host it for you. So the first thing we're going to do is create the Stripe customer, the Stripe user, and then after that we're going to add the customer ID to the token. I'm just going to apply those before we jump in and have a look at the code, just to make sure they're done. And then let's have a look at what's actually going on under the hood. Now, you'll note here that it's JavaScript. It's really nice and easy for anybody in the room who's familiar with JavaScript. You can write whatever you want up here. On the left-hand side, we've got a test suite. So you can get a JSON representation of an event and you can post it and you can test how your action would respond to that before even deploying it into production, which is a big improvement over the rules and hooks that we had where you either couldn't test them in one case or you had to put them into production to test them. and it meant that you'd probably have to have multiple tenants. And so this makes it much easier to just make a quick change, see what the effect would be. Are you happy with it? Yes, deploy. We also have key management. So you can see here I've already put in the Stripe secret key. This is similar to in Netlify or Vercel or Heroku, where you set your environment variables so that they're available to the application when it gets built. In this case, you can't get this information out again. You would need to delete and reapply that information. So it's an extra level of security for storing these secrets that you might need to use in your scripts. Perhaps most interestingly, or maybe not, you can actually put in your own Npm dependencies. And we support almost every single Npm library. There are 2 exceptions, and I can never remember what they are. But I think one of them is if there are any static bindings required, or if there are any C libraries that it depends on, which is a very small subset of all the NPM modules. All the other NPM modules should work. I think there's a limit of like 10 per action, because otherwise you'd bloat your action out. You don't want a 5 megabyte action running every time somebody logs in. But you can add your own dependencies in. You can see I put in the Stripe dependency here. And if we log in, we we basically pull the Stripe module in. We pass in the Stripe secret key so that the Stripe library can communicate with Stripe. The first thing we're going to do is check within this user to see whether the app metadata already contains a Stripe customer ID, because if they do, we don't need to create a new one. If they do, we just return. So at this point, we can say, well, there is no Stripe customer ID yet, so let's call on the Stripe object, the customer.create. We're going to pass some information in there, the email address of the user who just logged in, a few other bits of information. We're also going to pass in the user underscore ID. This is actually the SUB, the subject. So Stripe is going to know who the user is, and the user's going to, and Auth0 is going to know who the customer is. So we pass all that in, and eventually we get out of this object the customer response. We can get the ID out. That's a Stripe customer ID, and we store that in the app metadata as Stripe customer ID. Fairly straightforward, right? Any questions about how any of that's working at the moment? So Stripe requires because it's a machine-to-machine connection at this point, and there's no user involved, the Auth0 servers are making requests to the Stripe API, so there is a Stripe API key. So there's no auth token as such, it's an API key, which you could call that a token, I suppose. That's with Stripe? What's with Stripe, sorry?
Walk me through the flow again. There's an Auth0, and then it wants to connect with Stripe just to get the customer ID.
Sure. So the flow again is that when the user logs into Auth0 for the first time within your tenant, where you store all of your users, Auth0, before it completes that login process, is going to make a request to the Stripe API to say, I want you to create a customer and tell me what that customer's ID is. And now that customer and that Auth0 user are linked.
And Stripe will have the API key for that particular customer.
When you create a Stripe account as a developer, you will be able to get access to that API key, which you put into the Auth0 secrets area. Yes.
Right. Okay.
Cool. All right, so let's just jump over onto library here, and we'll have a look at the other custom function that we had, which is the add Stripe customer ID to the token. This is where we kind of complete that loop and make sure that React app has access to that information. And in here, very simply, we say if a Stripe customer ID exists, because we can't give any information that doesn't exist, and theoretically there should be a customer ID because this happens second in the flow. Of course, there could be network outages, there could be multiple reasons why it doesn't happen, which is why we put the check in. But if there's a customer ID, then we're going to set a custom claim on the access token, and we're going to pass that customer ID here into the access token with this custom claim. And as you can see, the custom claim actually looks like a URI. It is common practice to namespace custom claims. You don't have to, but it's good practice. That's all that one does. So theoretically, magic words. It's my get out clause in case the demo fails. Theoretically, if I log out and we log into purchase, and I'll log in again, we jump over to profile, we should see over here, we've got the Stripe customer ID has been passed through in the access token. So now, when I come back into home and I click on buy, not only should it get a response from the Stripe API endpoint via the Netlify function that we've written, telling me where to redirect to, but it'll also precede information that it knows about me because I already have a Stripe customer ID. So clicking on buy now, Takes me to the checkout page, and you can see up here that my email address has already been pre-populated. Now, I don't want you to see my credit card number, so please don't copy this. Can I put exclamation marks in? We're about to find out. Save my info. Actually, I'm not going to do that. So theoretically, this should now send me back to the success page. I've got a tick. If we look over in here, we should now have a new customer, which was generated at 2 p.m., 1 minute ago. If we look inside, we can see here's the subject, the auth user ID, ending in ADAC. We also have a customer ID ending in what looks a little bit like zoo. If we look inside the user, we should be able to see those align. We'll have up here ADAC as the last few letters of the subject, and we've got something that looks like it finishes in zoo at the bottom of the Stripe customer ID. So now, if we go back and buy another product, is it going to work? So I think if I'd saved my info for one-click checkout, I would have put my credit card details in, but I'm also in flight mode, so I didn't want to put my phone number in because that would have broken the demo. But anyway, you get the idea. So we've basically completed the loop now. People are able to make purchases through the application. We haven't had to do our own custom database, and it's all done through actions by connecting Auth0 and Stripe together. Any questions about that? I don't know. That would be a Stripe implementation thing. I imagine what that might do is if I was able to provide a phone number during the check-in process, then it would be able to pull that out automatically somehow. But that's like, I don't know what goes on under the hood in Stripe. I'm merely a developer user in that case. Yes?
So how is the customer data protection system? The question is, say for example, I'm registering to your website, but the data is actually sitting elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not really very transparent to the customer themselves.
Well, the customer data is going to sit in Stripe. So regardless of whether you have your own custom database or you store everything in Stripe, your terms of use for your website, and this is a legal question, and I'm not a lawyer and all of those things, you would probably need to, in either case, say, we will be sharing your information with third parties, because Stripe's always going to get that information.
It always doesn't have to be Stripe. It could be another.
I'm using Stripe because that's what I'm familiar with. You could use any other payment provider, as long as in that case they also provided a mechanism for you to store orders and products, and Stripe allows you to define imagery and pricing, multi-currency pricing and all sorts, as long as the other provider allowed you to do that. If there's anything in the other provider that is not provided that you need to display on your page, at that point you're going to need to have a custom database. So that's where Stripe works for me, because I don't need that custom database.
And are there any customers who have actually implemented this with the legal constraints?
I don't know. The question for everybody else was, are there any customers who have implemented this? This is purely a workshop for people to be able to play with React and Stripe and various other things, so I don't know. I literally have like 1 minute left, so I know it'll probably take you about a minute to ask me the question, so I think we'll probably wrap it up at that point.
Sure, I was going to volunteer you for hanging around to answer any more questions.
I'm definitely going to be hanging around, so I do want to quickly mention with my final 30 seconds, as I mentioned at the beginning, Auth0 was bought out by Okta. The Okta stall is here. We're sponsoring the event. I'd love you to come over and have a chat with us to work out whether Okta or Auth0 products work for you. Also, we've got a Lego giveaway. Come and find out how to play with Auth0. It'll take you like 5 minutes, and you'll be in the running to win some Lego. And yeah, just come and chat and find out more about this if you want. Thank you for your time.
Thanks ever so much.